Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now back in 2010 AMD launched the Phenom II X6 1090T. It could be used with AM2 Plus or AM3 motherboards, DDR2 or DDR3 RAM, and I'm not going to lie, it was one of my dream GPUs. CPUs, not GPUs. I say one of them because there were many. I just couldn't afford any of them. I think I had an A4-3300 APU, maybe a Core 2 Duo E5400 actually. Yeah, Phenoms and i5s were out of my budget. I probably played on my PS3 anyway, and while I still managed to get a few games running on my struggling computer, I do think I missed out by not experiencing the era that this processor is from in real time. I'm going off subject, but I also seem to remember certain AMD CPUs being unlockable in the sense that you could turn triple core chips into quad cores by changing a single BIOS setting. That's if you got lucky, of course. The X6 1090T didn't have this capability because it was already offering top-notch performance. It's a shame the following FX chips didn't make as much of an impact, at least not to me. Today then, we'll be revisiting one of my favourite AMD CPUs that I don't think I've reviewed on the channel before. The immediately obvious limitation of this thing is the lack of certain instruction sets like SSE 4.1, which will prevent some games from starting, unfortunately. This really gets it off to a bad start, but nonetheless, let's give this processor its first and final send-off and see what it can do in 2022. So in terms of pure CPU power, this thing seems to sit between a Celeron G6900, the new 12th gen Celeron, and an old i5 3550. That's just in terms of CPU power, but of course when it comes to games, things may be a little bit different. The first game I tried here was Battlefield 5, and as you can see it's running okay in terms of an average, but keep your eye on the CPU usage. That pretty much applies to every game tested today because it's running at 90 to 100% all of the time. You can see what I meant by the CPU temperature as well, 34 degrees. I don't think that's right. My thermal paste is just some cheap stuff, and the cooler I don't really think is that good. Perhaps there's a mistake somewhere in terms of that reading, but it might be right. I don't know. I don't think it is, but yeah. Battlefield 5 then, for our first game, not too bad. Let's move on to Fallout 4 here. I'm playing in Diamond City, which is one of the most busy areas in the game. Lots of NPCs, lots of things going on, and this CPU doesn't really like that. As you can see, I've just shot someone there, and after everyone's run after me, the frame rate starts to dip even more. As we head up to the higher parts of the stands, this frame rate climbs up to 60 FPS, but it doesn't last long, and when I'm pursued and when a lot's going on screen, it can drop under 30. It's very inconsistent, and your best bet might actually be to cap the FPS to 30 for a more solid overall experience. Fortnite then, well, this ran okay in terms of an average once again, but what you'll find in most of these games is that the 1 and 0.1% lows aren't that good at all. The GTX 1080 Ti is being utilised at about 40%, so yeah, not much work for it to do at 1080p with these settings. I'm running the game on the high preset, and the presets I've chosen and the graphical presets I've chosen for every game today is reflective of what the 1080 Ti could do under normal circumstances when paired with a more capable processor, something like my i3-12100F or i5-11400F. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5 then, and once again I've chosen a pretty high preset. Now this was odd in the fact that, well, first of all it ran, which I wasn't expecting at all. I didn't think this CPU had the necessary instruction sets to do so, but I don't think this game requires SSE 4.1, though I might be incorrect. Every so often though, the game went from running at over 60 FPS to just grinding to a, not necessarily a halt, but there were certain moments where after a few seconds of smooth gameplay, we would get like a horrible judder. Things would drop to 40 FPS briefly, and then it would go back to 70, and then it would go back down to 40. It wasn't consistent, just like Fallout 4, and I strongly recommend actually capping this to either 45 or 30 FPS because it's not exactly playable when you're going from 70 to 30 FPS. It doesn't feel too bad, but I wouldn't recommend it. GTA 5, well, this is an older one, so it ran pretty much fine. High settings once again, FXAA was on. The advanced graphical options were switched off. With these settings, we couldn't quite hit 60 FPS as an average, but in my opinion it is more than playable and you could turn a few things down, though how that would impact the CPU, I can't really say. It's certainly the limiting factor here once again, as it is in all of today's game tests. You can see that the CPU temperature again isn't much higher than 30, which I think is incorrect. The GTX 1080 Ti isn't really being used here. It's about 20 to 25% even with these settings, and we're using about 3.5 gigs of VRAM. I nicked this bus for some reason and drove downtown, which is one of the most intensive places to be in terms of frame rate performance. Resident Evil Village, another newer title, ran as well. I found that this is quite well optimized. You'll notice that the CPU hits 100% usage in this game quite often, but it doesn't really affect things in terms of stutter. I found that a lot actually with Resident Evil Village. Although your CPU could be the limiting factor as it is here, it doesn't cause the game to stutter too horrifically like it would in other titles such as Fortnite and Forza. It's not perfect by any means, but if you want to play Resident Evil Village here and you've got an X6 1090T or anything from the Phenom X6 lineup, then you should be good to go, with graphical settings that are pretty decent as well. This is the Prioritize Graphics option. In The Witcher 3, an old game, but a very good one. Again, performance does dip here and there, especially in busier cities like Novigrad here. I got into this fight with some witch hunters. Anywhere between 40 and 60 FPS seems to be the point in which the game sits at most of the time, at least in busy areas. Outside of Novigrad, this does climb up to 60. I haven't played this game in quite a long time properly, and I really want to get back into it, maybe when the next gen version comes out, because it is one of my favourites. Now, as I've been saying throughout this video, there are some problems, especially with the lack of instruction sets, and this does mean that it can be hard to gauge which games will run and which games won't. For example, Cyberpunk won't run, it just flatlines every time you go to start the game. Another game that does this is Deathloop, which actually tells you about the SSE error. And when it came to Red Dead Redemption, although we could get into the game and we could load the story mode, we could get into the options and everything like that, well, it crashed to the desktop every time. Overall, the Phenom II X6 is still a fun chip to play around with. It's one of my favourites in a weird way. I like things from this era of AMD, but it doesn't make too much sense in 2022. That said, if you do have one already, then you aren't completely limited to playing only older games, and some newer titles will run if you don't mind, say, implementing a frame rate cap or manage your expectations as far as settings are concerned. But this has been the Phenom X6 1090T look back. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.